afternoon, everyone. I'm Doug Chia, the Executive Director of the Conference Board Governance Center, and welcome to today's book discussion webcast. Today I'm pleased to be joined by authors Stephen Bainbridge and Todd Henderson. Stephen is joining us via satellite from Los Angeles, and Todd is joining via satellite from Chicago. Today we'll be talking about their recent book called Outsourcing the Board: How Board Service Providers Can Improve Corporate Governance. And we look forward to hearing about their research on the book, the details of this revolutionary idea that they propose in the book, that companies be allowed to outsource the board function to a third-party service provider, which they refer to as a board service provider. Today we welcome your questions and comments. So if you have any questions for me or Stephen or Todd, you're welcome to email us at the end of the session and we will get back to you with an answer. Our email address will appear at the bottom of your screen. And so now let's get started. Just want to introduce our two speakers. Stephen Bainbridge is the William D. Warren Distinguished Professor of Law at UCLA Law School, where he focuses on business acquisitions, M&A, and corporate governance. Todd Henderson is the Michael J. Marks Professor of Law at the University of Chicago Law School, where his research focuses on corporations, securities regulations, and law and economics. So, gentlemen, thanks for joining us. Why don't we begin by having each of you just tell us a little bit about your background. So, Steve, why don't we start with you?
Sure, and thank you for having us. I got my law degree at Virginia and then practiced with Arnold Porter in Washington for a few years. Went into law teaching at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, and spent 8 years there and got tired of winters that were too cold and summers that were too hot and moved out to Los Angeles 20 years ago and have been here at UCLA ever since. Over the last, 5, 6, 7 years, I've had the great privilege and pleasure of working with Todd on a number of projects, and it's been a very enjoyable experience. He's been a tremendous co-author.
All right, Todd, that's a good tee up for you.
I definitely feel the same way. There's a lot of love here at the beginning. So I went into the family business. My dad was an engineer, so that's what I did. I built dams for a while, actually in Los Angeles. They didn't get me to stay for 20 years. I went to law school here in Chicago, and when I graduated after clerking for a federal judge in New York, I worked for Kirkland & Ellis in Washington, D.C. My boss and closest working partner was Judge Brett Kavanaugh. So that's been an interesting couple of weeks for me. I left the law practice after Bush was elected in 2000, and most of my compatriots, including Kavanaugh, went into the government. I went instead the other direction and spent about 4 years at McKinsey & Company, where I led teams that were advising companies on a variety of different projects, strategy, governance, and all sorts of things. Not really law-related, but just more business consulting. And then about 14 years ago, I decided to try my hat on as an academic, and I've been here at the University of Chicago teaching ever since.
Great. Well, thank you for that. Why don't we start with just having you explain what compelled you both to write this book and how you began work on it together. Todd, maybe you want to address that?
Sure, Doug. I was a guest of Steve's at a conference at UCLA, and in response to a paper, and it might have been Yusha Rodriguez, but I don't really remember who I was commenting about, I asked a question. We were talking about boards and shortcomings of governance, things that are, which we'll talk about in a little bit, but I think which are pretty widely viewed as the state of play of boards among academics. And I asked what I thought was a sort of very Chicago question, there's a problem. What's the solution? More markets. So how could we get a market that's more robust for governance? And like lots of other things that companies do when they're looking for markets, they go out and shop around. And what would it look like if we had a board that was a company as opposed to a group of individuals? And this was just intended to be provocative. I didn't think too much about it other than trying to get the speaker to think on their feet and see their proposal or their particular research through a different lens. And as is pretty typical in our relationship, Steve, so I'm full of wacky ideas, and Steve knows a lot of law. So he cornered me afterwards and he said, hey, Henderson, that was fascinating, but there's a problem. It's illegal. There is this pesky thing called law, and Delaware has a requirement. And one thing about Steve is he's got sort of an encyclopedic command of corporate law. And he said, Delaware and every other state's got this rule that board members have to be natural persons. And our working relationship really started there. I'd admired Steve for a long time. His book, Corporation Law and Economics, is a kind of Bible of mine. And so when he said to me, your zany idea won't go anywhere, I took that as a challenge, an opportunity to get to work with him. That was sort of a dream of mine since he was such an intellectual mentor, even though he really didn't know that. So when I got back to Chicago, I wrote back to him and I said, hey, there may be this law, but, laws can be changed. Why don't we see what would happen if we ran with this proposal and the law wasn't there? And we started collaborating from afar and really haven't looked back.
Oh, great. So we will, you identified the key legal issue. We'll get to that in a second. But, in the first part of the book, you detail the origins and the evolution of the board of directors, which started out as kind of a quasi-governmental body, then really went to a management-centered board, then a service board, and now what we've referred to as a monitoring board, as the heavy function. So Steve, maybe you want to tell us a little bit of how we got here and what types of problems arise from the evolution to the modern day monitoring board.
Sure. Boards have been around for as long as we've had things resembling corporations. But it's really the development of the modern corporation sometime around the American Revolutionary War, both in England, but interestingly, even more so in the United States, where we started to develop entities that look an awful lot like what we think of as a modern corporation. And from that time on, boards have had three basic functions. Boards manage companies. Boards provide services to those who manage companies. And boards monitor those who manage companies. The management function today for large publicly held corporations, at least, is limited to things like, voting to give final approval to a merger, picking the chief executive officer, and so on. We've really moved away from the idea that boards actually run corporations. Certainly on a day-to-day basis, they don't. The service model persisted for a very long time. And the idea was that it was helpful to have on your board of directors folks like a representative of your principal creditor and maybe a representative of your principal outside law firm, and so on, who provided access to networks that could be helpful in raising capital, provide feedback from principal stakeholders about, whether or not they were going to cooperate with the corporation or not. Both of those models, however, have, starting in about the 1970s, given way to what is now the predominant model of the board's role, which is oversight and monitoring. And that really started in the wake of the Penn Central scandal, where the corporations, Penn Central and others that failed at that time, their boards generally were regarded as having completely fallen down on the job. And over time, as more and more emphasis focused on, well, we need boards to monitor management, that went hand in hand with an emphasis on having independent boards. Shifting from a model of the old managerial board where a substantial number, if not a majority, of board members would be people who were employed by the company or affiliated with the company. Today, of course, after Sarbanes-Oxley and Dodd-Frank and all of the changes in stock exchange rules and so forth, we have a model where the board is almost entirely independent, where it's now common that the only insider on a board would be the CEO. And that's had debatable impacts. In theory, independent directors are better monitors, but they have inevitably less information than insiders. They are part-timers. And one of the burdens of the book is to sort of walk through why boards today are so often failing. And we link it directly to the emphasis that first sort of best practice and now today the law puts on independence and the consequences of that in terms of lack of time and lack of incentives for directors to really be effective.
Got it. So, so it's a great history of boards and their evolution. I highly recommend folks read that first portion if you're interested in how boards started and got to where we are. So then you suggest that companies should have the right to outsource the governance function to a third-party service provider, which you call the board service provider, or BSP. Todd, just explain to us basically what that would look like and how it would work.
Sure, Doug. So companies of all sizes hire all kinds of professionals to help them. They hire accounting firms for accounting advice. And sometimes, in the case of accounting, the company has a demand for accounting expertise. There's also a regulatory component to them. They're obligated by the law to provide financial statements. So the thing that's motivating them to hire these experts could be internal, could be external, could be a mix of both of them. So companies hire accounting firms. If they need legal advice, they hire law firms. If they need strategic advice, they hire my old company or one of its competitors, a consulting firm. So companies routinely need lots of help, and they hire businesses to help them. There is a curiosity here that companies also need governance services. And when they hire governance services, they hire individuals. And we'll come in a minute to why they do that. But they hire, 9 to 12 independent people who are basically selling governance services to the company as a sole proprietor. They're not allowed to incorporate themselves, that is, form a professional corporation, and their relationship with each other, the different directors, cannot be under a entity level umbrella. They have to interact with those people solely as individuals. So the general idea is just very simple. Boeing, based here in Chicago, they need to hire some governance. They need to have someone provide some governance services for them. Instead of hiring 12 individuals to provide those, they would hire one entity to do that, a firm. Just like they hire a law firm, and just like they hire an accounting firm, and just like they hire a consulting firm, they would hire a governance firm. That governance firm would provide all the services that boards provide today. Steve mentioned some of those things, and although boards today provide mostly monitoring, they do provide the other things as well. It's not very transparent to shareholders or outsiders what that mix looks like, but boards provide some networking benefits, what Steve called service, some monitoring function. They might provide strategic advice. They might be called on to provide, and this is something that's happening a lot today, sort of crisis management. There may be marketing. There may be technology-related advice. So board members and boards are called on to give all sorts of different services, which we broadly put under the umbrella of governance, although most of the things that Steve talked about in terms of the roles of boards today, in terms of passing on things like hiring and firing, compensation, mergers, and the like, are what we mean by governance. But in short, what they would do is they would just hire a board service provider. And that board service provider would provide all of those functions that the modern day board does. It would just provide it in the context of a firm, an entity, as opposed to a group of individuals. And I think we'll talk a little bit later about what some of the benefits of that might be. So just to give you a sense of what this might look like in practice, the CEO of a company wants to make a decision. It's something that requires board approval. What would it look like? Well, under this broad idea, there's lots of possibilities. And we don't know sitting here in advance what the different kinds of permutations of board service providers would look like, or what the range of them would be. But a simple version would be that a board service provider would have a kind of board, a group of individuals that might look a lot like the current board. That group of individuals would engage with the CEO and other senior managers. They would have meetings just like they do today, but ultimately the decision would be of the BSP or board service provider, as opposed to kind of an individual vote of the individual members. And that would be the only difference. It might be, as we'll talk about, that system of 12 people as a kind of group deciding might not be the superior model. And, if McKinsey wanted to get into board service providing, or KPMG or Goldman Sachs or a startup, Boards R Us, they may come up with their own mechanism for resolving this. The real insight is just that there'd be a single entity as opposed to a group of individuals.
Got it. Okay, so basically corporations, they outsource all kinds of services. Why not board governance services? And so at the beginning, you identified one major problem here. At least in the United States, legally, you cannot do this. And this goes to the requirement that the company be governed by a board composed of natural persons. So, Steve, why don't you just give us a little bit of background on that requirement and the problems it poses?
Well, sure, and Todd told the story very well when we got to talking about this idea at that conference back in, I think it was probably 2010 or so. The first thing I did was say, well, you've got a problem with Delaware General Corporation Law, Section 141B, and it says that the board of directors shall be comprised of one or more persons, each of whom shall be a natural person. And that language is pervasive in state corporate codes. I believe it is present in every corporation code in the country. It's certainly part of the Model Business Corporation Act, for example. And one of the interesting things I think about the book was we have a chapter that looks around the globe and finds that these sort of natural person requirements are actually quite common around the globe. And even in countries where it's currently possible for an entity to serve as a board or as a member of a board, they've been thinking about getting rid of it. And I gather the problem, for example, in the United Kingdom has been that nefarious people will set up a corporation and then set up the board of directors as an entity that's based in some, money laundering, high bank secrecy law jurisdiction, and use it to protect their identities and so on. And the Serious Frauds Office over there found that even though the number of British companies that have an entity board is very small, the number of fraud cases involving British companies where there is a company board, an entity board, is disproportionately very high. And we assume, we haven't really been able to find out the full history of this, but we assume that it was similar concerns that motivated the Delaware law. As Todd suggests, we think that those concerns can be satisfied if we have, instead of just letting any random entity serve as a board service provider, we have a market in which those services are being provided by, the McKinseys of the world, or maybe big consulting spin-offs of accounting firms or of law firms, maybe corporate governance consulting boutiques would take it on. And Todd and I are both pro-market folks, but I think he tends to be a little more pro-market than I am. I would be quite content, for example, with a rule that said that just as you have to be a certified public accounting firm that's registered with the PCAOB in order to do audits, you might have to be a registered board service provider that's registered with, some hopefully self-regulatory organization. But I could imagine us in response to the concern that they've raised in places like the UK. I think that could be addressed by a system of standards and licensing, and that once those are in place, that there really should be no objection to eliminating the natural person requirement. What is, and then there's a lot of things that follow on from that. There are a whole slew of, for example, stock exchange listing standards, federal securities law rules that assume directors are natural persons and would probably have to be modified. But getting rid of Delaware Section 141B would be the place to start.
So,
can I make two quick points, Doug? I mean, to reiterate something I said, we don't favor what could be another motivation of the natural person requirement, which is to prevent individuals who are serving as directors from reducing their own potential liability for breach of their fiduciary duties by forming a professional corporation. That, I think, is a bad idea because it creates a kind of moral hazard problem. They can insulate their liability by having a sort of bankruptcy-proof entity, and I think that's a bad idea. And that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about an entity that would, we think, and we can talk about this later, actually increase the accountability of the board by having it be a firm as opposed to individuals. The second thing I'll say is that there's already a move in the direction of entities as providing governance. So lots of investment vehicles and LLCs and the like, under various laws, state and federal, can have entities in something that looks like a board. And, the model we're sort of moving towards here for publicly traded companies looks a little bit like private equity, just at a broader scale, where although private equity firms have individual directors to satisfy the requirements of this, what we think is an outdated Delaware law. In reality, the private equity fund is serving the governance function. And so it's basically just like a box checking thing that they're doing there. So there are examples in other parts of the world that we're becoming, not overseas as Steve suggested, but in other kinds of business arrangements that we're becoming more comfortable with doing away with this idea, which we think is, like I said, out of date.
Okay, but as you indicated, this idea, there's some precedent for it, both outside the United States and inside the United States when we don't think about large public companies and you look at the private company world. So that's definitely instructive. There are going to be two groups of people who really are skeptical to this idea. One are current board members, and the other are shareholders. So let's talk a little bit about the current board members who, essentially the suggestion is they might be replaced by a professional service provider. So how would they be sold on this idea that a professional service provider might not be such a bad idea and might actually be better and more efficient than having a board of 9 to 12 individuals that are not company employees?
Steve, you want to handle that one, or you want me to take it?
Yeah, sure.
Steve,
I'd be happy to take that one. I think that you're quite right that there would be some resistance from the sort of, professional directors who serve on, 10, 11, 12 boards, whatever the, sometimes outrageous number is. But I'm not terribly worried about the director community as such. They are, somewhat organized through organizations like the NACD and I suppose the Conference Board to some extent. But having said that, I think the people that you really have to persuade are going to be the large institutional shareholders and the CEOs. And the pitch, I think that one makes to them is that current boards don't work very well. And we have a proposal that we think provides an alternative that can be tested in the market, and we are confident the market would show is superior. And to say to the large institutional investors, look, would you rather deal with 12 part-timers who get hired in off the street, or would you rather deal with a professional, with a team of professionals? And this is one of the big pluses we think of the board service provider model is economies of scale. Instead of having a single individual sitting in a director's seat and being overwhelmed by their own work obligations, the other companies where they serve on boards, and so on, you would have a team of professionals focusing probably on at most 1 or 2 or 3 companies who would be very close to full-timers, devoted to assisting management to make better decisions, bringing expertise in. Firms are very used to hiring in expertise. They hire in lawyers, they hire in accountants, they hire in financial service providers. They outsource to, human resources, bookkeeping, whatever. And so the idea that what you're doing is bringing in corporate governance expertise really should be a familiar idea once they stop and think about that. And I think the pitch to the large institutional investors is the same. Look, you'd have greater economies of scale. You'd have people who were much more full-time focused on monitoring your portfolio companies. and you'd be engaging with, teams of professionals, many of whom will have come out of the same educational training base as the folks running the big pension funds and so on. And so I think if we can get them on board with the idea that there are benefits to be had by this model, that there will be, opportunities to overcome, I think, the inevitable resistance that people who are, doing well under the current system, folks who are currently directors, and maybe shouldn't be, I think their resistance can be overcome.
Well, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah,
Todd.
I think let me just add to that a little bit. So I agree with everything that Steve said. I think everybody who runs American corporations, and we should be clear, American companies, and there's some pretty good research from an economist at Stanford on this point, American companies are the best run companies in the world without question. And so we're not indicting the American governance system. We just think it could be a lot better. And as we point out in the book, by the virtue of how the governance system in the country runs, that is, it's provided by these individuals in a very non-transparent market, we don't really have a way of measuring good governance. Good governance is inexorably tied up with firm performance. Everyone thought the Enron board was fabulous until Enron exploded. So being able to cleave apart a market of governance and a market for products and services or for control, that's a very important component of what we're talking about. But I think everybody involved in corporations, management, boards, institutional shareholders, retail shareholders, employees, everybody should like this idea because it's going to raise the standards of excellence that the company is able to achieve. And the reason for that, and Steve alluded a little bit to this, is because providing things through firms is a more efficient way of providing anything. There's lots of reasons for that, but let me just mention one. I teach at the University of Chicago Law School, so therefore I'm contractually obligated to mention Ronald Coase at every possible public appearance. Ronald Coase, who won the Nobel Prize as a law professor, he asked a very simple question in the 1930s. Why do we have firms at all? Why aren't all activities of an economic nature, why don't they just take place through contracts in a market? So we, imagine there's a company that produces widgets. Why do each employee of that company sell their labor to each other via contracts? Why do they group together under this thing called a firm? And Coase's great insight was that firms arise, these things called firms arise, and people cooperate for economic activity through an entity where the transactions costs or the cost of doing business in a hierarchy are lower than if we had these kinds of individual contracts. So if I want to get photocopies made, I can walk down the hall and tell my assistant, make 5 copies of this. That's a lot cheaper than me wanting to make 5 copies, putting out an RFP on the internet, having Kinko's bid for it and different companies bid for it, writing an individual contract and having them write 5 copies, make 5 copies. Now, of course, if you think about that in the broader context, the computer that I'm looking at you through right now is made by Apple, but it's made by Foxconn in China. They've outsourced the manufacturing process because they found that doing a market transaction is more efficient for that production. Now think about this in the context of a board. You're a board member, and you're asked a question about cybersecurity, about how to deal with a Me Too scandal, about how to deal with a product failure, about how to deal with a governance failure, or a merger, or a compensation issue. All of those things are very complicated. You might not have the expertise. And the company comes to you and the law comes to you and says, you have to make this decision. And oh, by the way, if you get it wrong, you might end up in court and your personal wealth is at stake. You may be liable individually with no way of preventing it other than buying a little bit of insurance from having to bear the liability. That's a pretty horrible position to be in for a director. And the only way that you can get the expertise you need, whether it's about how to deal with a crisis or about cybersecurity or about marketing or strategy or compensation, is you've got to go out and hire an expert. And we've made a little bit of progress in this country in giving boards a little bit more authority to have some purse strings where they can hire some experts, but we're forcing all those contracts to be on a contracted basis, like me having to hire FedEx Kinkos to do my photocopies. Wouldn't it be a lot better if you were a director to be able to, instead of having to hire an expert to help you, to be able to just walk down the hall, knock on the door of your colleague and say, oh, hey, this company that I'm working with and in providing governance, they've got a really tricky compensation question about whether vested options should be tracking the market or whatever the issue should be. Can you jump in on this and help me and give me a quick tutorial so I can provide that advice? That's empowering board members. That's giving CEOs the possibility of getting better advice on a whole range of issues without having to have these costly market transactions. So the real key, I think, here is to not think of this in a negative term, but in a positive way, that it's really about giving everybody who's got the same objective function and trying to maximize the value of this firm the tools they need to do it at the lowest possible cost.
Well, no, that's that's all great, and I think to me it's interesting that more boards right now, even though they're given the authority, don't hire more experts where they probably could use it. But let's go back to the shareholder point. As we know, these days shareholders want more and more power. Part of that is deciding on who is in the boardroom. But the BSP, as you've described it, would be another service provider essentially chosen by management. And so how would shareholders get comfortable with that? What's their opportunity to to have some role in the selection process and hire and fire these BSPs? Todd, maybe you want to expound on that.
Sure. So, as we see it, right now, shareholders' ability to influence what happens in corporations is pretty limited. Yes, if you are managing things really badly, Elliott Management might take a 20% stake in you or 15% stake in you and threaten to sell that and talk bad about you on Squawk Box and in the hopes that you'll install an Elliott director into the boardroom. I think that state of affairs is rotten from top to bottom. Everything I just said is really bad. First, the only way that Elliott or any other activist can really achieve anything is by taking an enormous stake in the business. Then, when they do that, they threaten the CEO, and they go in and they put in place a director who is responsible to them and them only. That kind of special interest director goes in. It's likely to upset the collegiality of that board function. There's issues about different masters. I think that system is pretty terrible. The reason we have gotten to that system is because the idea of changing governance is so difficult. Of course, anybody can run to be a director of any company. I could run to be a board member of Boeing or Starbucks or Apple. I just would have to figure out who all their shareholders were and send a proxy card to all of them and hope that me and a slate of directors that I've running with could convince all the shareholders to vote for us. So that system is prohibitively expensive, and that means that director elections look more like elections in North Korea than they do in the United States. The virtue of the BSP, one of its many virtues, is that it would make that whole process of governance and who is governing a lot more easy to change. So, for instance, imagine that there's a board currently, let's say we got rid of the Delaware legal restriction, and there's a board, there's 12 individuals who are currently serving as the board of a company, and a consulting firm has started a board service provider, and they want to be they think they can govern the company better. They could run a proxy contest. That company, McKinsey, KPMG, whoever it is, presumably has a national reputation. People know who they are. They have a reputation for doing good work at a reasonable cost. It would be very easy for them to communicate to investors, you should trust us and you should hire us to run this board. That means all in the cost of running a proxy, and if they're running to be the governance, the board service provider for lots of firms, they can have a kind of portfolio approach. So even if they lose a bunch of those, as long as they win a few, then that might be a successful business. So the cost of running a proxy contest should be a lot lower, which means shareholders would have a voice instead of only in a very few cases where activist investors see an economic gain. Maybe it's a short-term economic gain, and they do this kind of very, we're going to put our guys in there to spy in the boardroom and pressure the CEO for what we want, which might be short-term profits as opposed to long-term profits or whatever it is. We imagine a much more robust market for corporate governance in which lots of different entities are competing for the shareholders at lower cost to get them to vote for them. So you can imagine that system would lead to actually much more robust and shareholder-friendly system. And we can talk, if you're interested, about alternatives to that, because I don't think that our proposal necessarily means there'd be more turnover in boards. But insofar as you're worried about shareholders not having a voice, I think this gives them much more a voice than what they would have under the current activist-only system.
Yeah, and Doug, if I could just follow that up with a couple of comments. We were very careful to structure our proposal in a way that we think is neutral as between management and the investors. And we think, for example, that there are a number of features of our proposal that investors might very well prefer to the current system. When most folks are first presented with our proposal, the model that they seem to have in mind as they conceptualize it is the independent auditor model, where basically, and I think you said this, management picks the outside auditor, and then every year there's a more or less pro forma vote on the part of the shareholders to retain that auditor. But as Todd indicated, we think that one of the advantages of transparency in our proposal is it's going to be much easier for shareholders to compare the performance of the BSPs to the performance of individual directors. If you've got 12 directors at one company, and then 3 of them over here at another company, and 3 of them over here at another company, how do you compare the abilities of one set of directors to another? But suppose you've got KPMG and McKinsey, just to pick 2, each of which are serving as a board service provider for maybe 10 companies. And you can figure out what's their portfolio return. You've got one transparent entity, publicly available data, and you can say, okay, KPMG is not doing a very good job as a board service provider. So number one, there'd be more transparency and more information and more ability to compare, directors. Whereas under the current system, you have to compare the board as it is to some hypothetical fictional board that you have no reason to think is going to be that much better. The other possibility, as Todd mentioned, would be proxy contests both at the start of the process, but also from time to time. Suppose, for example, that KPMG has been Apple's board service provider for several years, and a lot of big institutional investors haven't been happy with their performance. They could get together and nominate that McKinsey come in and replace KPMG and support a proxy contest. McKinsey could initiate it, as Todd suggested, or it could be initiated by shareholders making that nomination. And the last point I want to make is that in some ways, our proposal is really intended to be an open access framework. And what I mean by that is there's a lot of flexibility here. Suppose, for example, you have a management that's concerned with short-termism and investors that are willing to accommodate that, but as you say, they want a voice in in who gets to run the company. Well, you could imagine the following deal being offered. The company says, okay, we don't want to have rapid board turnover because we want to be able to plan for the long term. So let's go 3 years between board elections. And once the board's elected, they serve 3 years. But then when their term is up, we will have an open election. You know, instead of having a single slate or a single BSP that you vote up or down, we will invite 3, 4, 5 BSPs to provide proposals to make an argument, kind of like, you know, a political argument as to why you should pick us, so that the shareholders would have choice in terms of selecting the BSP that they think is the best among a number of alternatives. So with that kind of flexibility built into the proposal, we think there's a lot here that shareholders would find very attractive.
Got it. Guys, what kind of feedback have you gotten on the book so far? I mean, the book came out pretty recently, but you had a pretty substantial article outlining this before that. So what kind of feedback have you gotten from people in the governance community, investors, et cetera? Steve, maybe you want to start with that?
Sure. Actually, and Todd can speak to the feedback he's gotten. A lot of the feedback I've gotten has come from overseas. I heard from a outfit down in Colombia where they actually are trying to get something like this started up and have promised that one of these days they'll get me down there to talk to them about how it might run and so on. But they think they can do it under their local law down there, and they're very interested in trying to experiment. There was a Australian fellow who's I think one of these professional directors, sits on I think about 15 boards, who wrote a reply in some Australian corporate governance magazine that he then fired off a copy to me, which basically said that it was demonically inspired. It would be the ruination of corporate governance because these BSPs would simply work for management. They would be, you know, captured by management and be tools of management. And, you know, obviously that's an issue, but I don't think that that's an insurmountable issue. I think, you know, you'd have to have good independence rules. But, you know, current boards get captured by management. We all know this. And a BSP where, you know, your job is dependent on keeping your boss at the BSP happy, as opposed to keeping the CEO happy, may be a rather different accountability environment, and it may actually lead to greater independence. At least we think it will. And so I think that kind of, you know, we stepped on some toes with this idea, but I think that folks that have thought about it rigorously have seen that, yeah, it's worth trying.
Todd, what about you? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I think so all I would add to that is along the toe-stepping point, you know, any idea that suggests that we should disrupt a very established industry is going to be received with aggressive condemnation or ignoring it altogether. There are plenty of vested interest in the current system, you know, that goes to current board members, the consulting firms that provide them, the companies that are used to dealing with them, the Delaware lawyers who have made, and judges who have made themselves, you know, huge on the world stage by having all kinds of cases and controversies about this independent director and that special committee and all these things. In our world of governance providers being provided through firms, all that law just goes away. just save all that effort because those issues no longer become really relevant. So I think there's a lot of people that would be anxious not to see this happen. I think it would take is for some entrepreneur who is starting a company and wants to, like Uber did, to sort of challenge the status quo with a purpose of disruption, to build this into their system, and then push the boundaries by showing that it's a better mousetrap. It's very easy for us to sit back and in the pages of a book and in our perches in the ivory tower preach about how we think this would be better. But I think it's hard to convince people of things, especially when they haven't really been convinced that the current system is better. They're just part of it. And so I think actually showing people would be the secret to this. And I think we should be clear that our suggestion is actually pretty humble. We're not saying this should be required. We could be wrong. We don't run companies. We're just academics. We're just pointing out that there is this weird law that we think keeps companies from experimenting. If this natural person requirement didn't exist in Delaware and the stock exchange requirements didn't talk about the number of independent directors and people with accounting degrees and so forth on committees, I'm very confident that some entrepreneur in Silicon Valley, some Elon Musk kind of character would try this. Because it's what private equity firms basically do. They would experiment in governance, and those experiments in governance would be like all experiments and all innovations. They'd have lots of failures, and there might be some successes. We've been stuck in a governance rut for coming on 50 years because there are legal rules that prevent experimentation. Steve mentioned this. We have no transparency about how much companies spend on governance. We don't know how individual directors vote. There's no way in the unbelievably data-rich environment that we live in to measure corporate governance. And one of the reasons why, a major reason why, is it's not provided in a market. So we want to just clear the decks to allow people to experiment in government and see which of those experiments would actually be successful. We're betting that there are some out there that might happen by freeing this up. We don't know exactly what they would look like. But we're in favor of experimentation.
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating. I think the fact that you point out that one legal requirement that directors be natural persons has really kind of restrained us from getting innovative, and this would be an innovative and disruptive approach. Of course, laws would have to be changed, but personally, I think there's a lot in your book that kind of raises some important issues about corporate governance and how it could be improved with some of the, just forcing people to think about this concept, I think can go a long way in expanding the discussion that we have, which tends to be kind of tweaks and little fixes here and there. So guys, thank you very much. We're running out of time here. And so I just want to thank you again for joining us. Again, for the folks watching, the book is called Outsourcing the Board. I highly encourage you to read it. The first half of the book is a fantastic summary of the whole history of boards and how we got to where we did. And then the second half is a very cogent argument about the board service provider and all of the issues it raises and how each issue could be addressed. And so if you have any questions for any of us, feel free to email them to governancecenter@conferenceboard.org, and we'll try to get back to you. And thanks so much for joining us today, and we will see you next time.